I'm excited because I've got Vaneetha here. I'm so looking forward to connecting with her today and hearing her heart. I've been reading her blogs. She sent me some blogs to read. She's in some amazing places. She'll tell you more about herself and where she appears. But I was like blown away by them. I was telling her, it made me feel like she was sharing these things, and I felt so much hope as she was like giving the words to describe things. Like, yes, that's so true. I've seen it. But at the same time, it drove me to go deeper, like to want to know God more and to be like, oh, it's okay to go through the hard things with God. It's okay to question God and to find Him in these things. So that's what we're going to be talking about today: is where is God when you're suffering and hurting and dealing with loss. And so she's definitely walked a path that understands this, and I am looking forward to learning alongside everybody. So, Vaneetha, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I'm Vaneetha. I write and speak about suffering, which people are like, oh, that's kind of a downer topic. And I mean, it does seem like it is, but I have met God in the darkest of places. And so I think it's actually a very joyful topic because I feel like where I have met God the most deeply has been in the deepest pain. And so when I look back over my life, I'm very thankful for the things I've been through. But just a thumbnail, super quick, was got polio as an infant. Was went lived through a lot of bullying as a child. Was able to walk without braces at age 7, but lived in and out of the hospital. But then was able to live a pretty normal life. So I felt like most of my suffering was behind me. Came to Christ at 16, thought my life was going to be easy and great. And it was for a while, but then got married a classmate. Then our second had 4 miscarriages, then had a child who had a heart issue and died because the doctor made a mistake. He was 2 months old.
Oh my
And then was diagnosed with post polio syndrome, which means my body is going backwards. So all these gains that I had made when I was younger are going backwards. So now I use a wheelchair most of the time. My arms and hands don't work very well. So that's been a huge change. And then after 6 years after that diagnosis, my ex-husband left me for someone else. And I raised 2 adolescent daughters as a single parent. So a lot of hard things kind of in a nutshell. But I like to say God has not only been good, he's been better than I imagined. And
wow.
I feel like God has met me in those places, and so that's why I started writing. My background isn't writing, but I just started writing because I found God to be so faithful in the midst of those things. So right now I write a blog at Vaneetha.com, which my daughters say is the most narcissistic name. So there's that. It used to be Dance in the Rain, and so you can find it at Dance in the Rain also if you go look at that. But so I write about suffering there, and I write for various other sites. I write regularly for Desiring God. I write for Gospel Coalition. I'm speaking there this summer on suffering, actually, and I've written for Christianity Today. I've been on podcasts like Family Life Today. I was just on there. It aired a few weeks ago, and Johnny and Friends several times. So really kind of live in this world of suffering, disability, struggle, and how we find faith through all of those things.
Yes. And that is a hard thing. And I love when you said, but God's been so faithful. And like when I'm hearing your story, like my part of me cringes and like, oh, and then but you're like, but God is so faithful in those things. And I'm like, wow, I want to know these treasures that you found about God and learn more about how you seen Him in the suffering that you've walked
Mm.
through, and hope that we get some hope and encouragement to know His heart through these things. So, are you ready to get started?
I am.
All right. So let's talk about when God writes your story in a way you don't like. And I think many of us listening here can all relate to this and be like, God, what did you do? Because this is not what I would have done with the pen.
Right,
Not at
right.
all. And sometimes Christians, annoying to be like, you just can't see the other side. There's glorious. I'm like, what if there's no glorious ending?
Mm.
And it's hard. And so I really want to hear like your story on that, and for you to share some about that. And we can go through that in a couple different questions. Like how do you get your mind off of what is missing in our story? And so let's start there with that, and then you can share anything else that you feel led to share as well.
Okay. Well, I always say, like, if it was up to me, I would have written my story differently. Like, I just wouldn't have written it the way that it is. And yet, God has met me in that. But in the middle, each time of all of those hard things that I talked about, I really question, what are you doing, God? Like, why are you letting this happen? So I don't want this conversation to sound like, wow, it is just easy. You trust God and it's easy. It's not easy.
Mhm.
It's devastatingly difficult. And so I would like to say, if you are in a very hard place, like, I'm not trying to get you to cheer up and say, okay, it's all going to be fine. I
Mhm.
just want you to see that this is not the end. Sometimes we watch movies and like we're on the edge of our seat or we're crying, like there's really hard parts. But then in the end, we see that all of those things had a purpose often, like the hard things turn out differently. They don't get tied with a bow. The bow comes in heaven. Randy Alcorn says, happily ever after is a blood bought promise for those of us in Christ. So that's happily ever after. And yet, even in our stories, God is writing something really good in this life. And He is doing, John Piper says, God is doing 10,000 things in everything He does. So we can't see it when we're in the middle of our story. In the middle of our story, all we often see, in the middle of the hard parts, is pain. And yet, we can hang on knowing this is not the end. And I have found, in the middle of my story, both my daughters walked away from faith. My husband left us. My body was failing. Like, I remember when I wrote that, I just thought life is so hard. Will it ever get better? And I'm guessing there's people listening that are wondering, will it ever get better? And I don't want to say, oh, it's absolutely going to turn around. Every single thing that you are crying about is going to be different. But there are things that will be different. Like, I did get divorced and then I remarried an amazing man. My daughters came back to faith, but my body is still failing. Like, so there are hard things that don't get tied up. And yet in those hardest things, God is there. God meets us. And our stories all have a happy ending. And God uses these pieces of our story to change us. Like, for everybody listening, there's probably been times when you've talked to somebody who's gone through suffering and you're so thankful they can say, I understand. I have been in a place like that. And you will get to do that with people. Like, I feel like every single hard thing I've been through, I have sat with somebody and said, wow, I know. I don't know what you're going through because we all experience pain very differently. So I try not to ever say that because I don't know. But I went through something similar and this is how I feel. And I feel like that gives people a huge level of comfort that we're all not like living our best life now and everybody's not saying everything's great. So that's one thing, and suffering deepens our faith. I don't know where I would be in my relationship with the Lord without suffering. So in the middle of my story, I may not have seen all those things, but just even one step away from it, you can see it. And so in the middle, what you have to do is trust and just say, okay, God, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand. This feels so hard. But give me eyes to see. Help me to trust you, even in the middle of this dark place in my story.
Yes. And I love what you shared about our ever afters in heaven. And I think so much of Christian gospel sometimes has sold us that our happily ever afters here. At least that was the lie I was sold. So it
Yeah.
feels like God betrayed you of like, wait, I was supposed to get a good Christian marriage if I do all the right things, or my children supposed to love the Lord if I did all the right things. And I'm supposed to go through this in church if I stand up for what's right. And it's like, no, like, and you look at the Bible and you see those who chose Jesus didn't get a happily ever after, or even know the fulfillment of their promises here on earth.
Right. Right. I mean, you look at John the Baptist, I mean, his life is so hard. It starts with this huge promise and proclamation and all of these amazing things. And then the minute Jesus starts his ministry, John's imprisoned, so shortly after, and he dies in prison. And I don't say that to depress anybody, but to say God had an amazing call on John's life. And Jesus said, no one born of woman is greater. So, I mean, God saw all that John did. And yet his story isn't tied up with a bow in this life. But
Mhm.
I can only imagine what it looks like in heaven. Like, I feel like if we see this heaven, death as a passage from this life to the next, then I think we would see happily ever after. We would see so many of those things, but we sort of see this hard stop with this life is our death. And yet that's really just the beginning.
Yes, I think we don't see all that God does. I'm sure John did not see on earth all that God was doing and weaving through his story. And that we see that with so many people's lives is we don't know what God is doing through our brokenness and how God is working this for our good in our hearts and our souls, and how he's working it for the good of other people around us to heal their hearts and souls as well. And we don't know those things till we get to heaven. And that's
Yeah.
like where we get the happily ever after with Jesus, when the tears are wiped away and we get to rejoice for all of eternity and be like, wow, Jesus, that was super short, but I get to rejoice for all of eternity that these people knew your love, or these people got to understand you in this way, or this, whatever it is. Like that's the reward in life. I feel like sometimes is thinking about that. So I appreciate you sharing. There's something else you want to say on that?
Yeah, well, there's one thing. I wrote an article recently for Design God about reward in heaven, and I really believe that people who have suffered a lot on earth and turn to the Lord in it, there'll be a reward in heaven for that. Second Corinthians 4:17 is our light, this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us a weight of glory that is beyond all comparison. That's the ESV, but the word preparing really is producing. And so our afflictions are producing glory. So they're doing something. And the Bible does talk about reward. And so it's not that it's just like we'll get to rejoice. I think there'll be reward for suffering. So there's something really significant about that. And when I first heard that idea, I was like, I don't know. That sounds very works oriented. But it really isn't that we're earning our salvation, but the Bible talks so much about reward. And I think that's one place where people will get a reward.
Wow, that was so moving. I'm like, that just encouraged my heart. I appreciate you sharing that. And it reminds us, those that have suffered a lot, you're not unseen and forgotten by God.
Yes.
You're
Yeah.
seen, and he's weeping, and he plans to reward you in the end for what you've walked through, if you've clung to him through those things and
Yes.
found him in it and used that to help for the good of yourself and the other people around you. So thank you for sharing that. That was beautiful. I was like, oh, make me cry.
Oh.
And let's go to our next question. And that was from another blog post that you wrote. And I saw the title and I was like reading this and I was like, oh, this is so good. What if my deepest longings are never met
Mm.
and my nightmares come true?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Wow. How did one begin to face this fear and walk through your process? Walk us through your process. How do you even face that?
Yeah. Well, it was a post entitled What If the Worst Happens? And really, that's our fear for all of us. Maybe life isn't even looking horrible today, but we think, there's signs that it's not going to go well. I mean, even people with young kids. I mean, when I had young kids, I was like, their disobedience, like, I'm going to be bailing them out of jail, and maybe, I mean, there are people here that are bailing their kids out of jail. So I'm not saying that's the worst, but I think sometimes we go to the place of the worst and recognizing even if we go there, God's going to be there. And for me, that was a huge shift because I was thinking, what happens if, at this point, I was divorced when I wrote this. So it's like, what happens if I never remarry? What happens if my kids never come back to the Lord? What happens if my body never gets better? What happens if I'm in an institution? So there were all these questions I had for the Lord, like what's going to happen to me? And a lot of fears because I had this sort of unwritten rule with God that he didn't sign, but I signed this contract. Like, if I do the right stuff, you're going to do the right stuff for me.
Mhm.
And really believe that. And often when I saw people with a lot of suffering, thought, oh, what did you do? That's just kind of the way we are. Like, whose fault is it? God's faithful if you are suffering. And we hear that from the prosperity gospel. Like, if you're suffering, just get your life back on track because God just wants to bless you. And so you feel a lot of condemnation when your life isn't going well. And this idea of what if the worst happens was sort of a friend of mine had actually given a talk about that and how people in the Bible all asked, what if this doesn't happen? And she compared it to Daniel 3, where Nebuchadnezzar says, if you don't worship this God, that this idol that I've erected, I'm going to throw you into the fire. And they say, our God is able to rescue us, but even if he doesn't, we won't worship you or this idol. And I think that's kind of like, our God is able to change this future that we are worried about. But even if the worst happens, God will be there. And I realized that, like, my nightmare was my husband leaving, and it happened, and God walked me through that. And so recognizing, even in the darkest places you can go to, there is nowhere you can go that God is not there. Nowhere. And so recognizing that really transformed my own outlook, thinking, okay, there is nowhere I can go. There is, I might end up in an institution not able to move my arms and legs as a single person, even, but God will be there. God will not leave me. And that was so comforting to me. It really helped take the fear out of life for me.
Yes. And he gives us grace for the moment, not grace
Mhm.
for the future. And I think sometimes in our head, something somebody's always said to me is, but that's not happening to you right now, like in your fear. So God isn't giving you the grace for that. Like
Right.
he's not said to worry and concern yourself with that. So yes, it's going to feel really scary because you're not there. And if you have
Right.
to go there, God will be with you and it'll work out. And I love something you share, and it brings out a question I have. And I think, like you're talking about your husband leaving, that's your greatest fear, and what if that happens? And I think so many times too, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is we think we need these things to be happy. And if we don't have these things, then we can't really be fulfilled or joyful in life or happy, I guess you would say. What would you say to that?
I think God rewrites what we think we need. When things are taken away, we don't realize we didn't need them. Like, I would have said I needed kids who were faithful to the Lord. I needed all those things. And those are the things that I worked for. And as I mentioned, a good marriage. And I worked really a lot on our marriage, prayed for my husband, felt like, okay, these are the pillars. Like, I don't care if I'm not successful. I don't care about all these things. I don't need a big house, but I want this. And I think we all have I want this. Like, God, I'm not asking for $1 million, but I want this. And we cling to that, and then when it's taken away, I think it's very hard for us to imagine that life could be good. And at first, we can't imagine it. Like, when it first happens, it's like it's never going to be good again. And then yet, as God walks us through our nightmares, we find that, as I said, is not only good, he's better than we imagine. Like, we need him. We don't need other things. John Newton has this thing that he said to a woman. He was writing a letter. I think it was to his sister. I'm not sure. But he said, everything is needful that he sends. Nothing can be needful that he withholds. So everything that God is sending in our life, we need that. And we don't need the things that we don't have. And recognizing that is an amazing shift of, God is giving me what I need. Just, it's kind of like Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want, or I have everything I need.
Wow, those are really good points. And I guess to say that we don't have everything we need for happiness is to say God isn't God. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's really to say, God, you're not enough. And it's like shifting that mindset of, okay, yeah, if you end up in this worst place, I get more of God. And I've seen in my life, and I'm sure you, as you said, you've seen, like, even losing the things that I feared losing the most, in the end, I found God greater than those things and found a measure of his grace and knowing his presence that I wouldn't have known otherwise. So it's like, okay, you're here, there, back then, you'll be with me here. So I appreciate that and everything. So, and Brooke is saying, I think survivors struggle with the certainty that God will be there when it feels like he has failed them. How does a person begin with God again when they have failed, I guess, that God failed them or feel they failed?
Yeah, I would say it does feel like God fails us when the things that we don't want happen. And I understand that when When my son died, I had begged God. So I was teaching Bible study and found out our son had a heart problem. And then, I mean, before he was born. And then when he was taken by ambulance. My husband went with him to the ER. And I remember I got on my knees and I begged God to save Paul. Like I remember promising him everything I could think of. And I thought, God's going to do this. Like I've been faithful. Like this is not, not asking him to like take away his heart problem, although that would be amazing, but just spare his life. And I got to the hospital and they said Paul was dead. And it just felt so much like God had failed me. Like, how do you beg God for something and have him not do it? And so for a long time, I felt distant from God. Like, why did God let me down? And yet the promise isn't that God will do everything we ask for. The promise is God will never leave us and he will never fail that. Like it's interesting because Joshua says, not one of the good things that you have promised has failed. And so when you look at God's promises, though, they're not protection as much as presence. And God gives us everything we need. And so I think to begin again with God is really to ask God to open your eyes to how he is loving you and with you and providing for you is what I had to do. Like, God, show me you're here. Show me you care. Show me that you'll never leave me.
Wow, I never thought of asking God for that. Like, and it sounds simple, but just show me making those your prayers. And I think God wants us to come there and even state, I don't feel you're here, and express that and get it out. God already knows those things, and to let him know. And the Lord, I'm thinking of the verse that says, taste and see the Lord is good. Try me.
Yeah.
So I know for me, there's times in my life where I feel like I was jumping out of a skyscraper and testing him, and like, as he told me to, but but in the end, he caught me, even though you're fearful that he won't.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like when we are willing to say, okay, God, show me your goodness, which I have done multiple times. Like, I don't feel your presence. Like, he doesn't want us to muster up anything. And that has been revolutionary for me because I thought I'd have to do that myself. Like, I needed to come with the faith, or I needed to come with all of these things. And we don't have to come with anything. We just come with, hey, God, I don't feel you're here. And I'm feeling completely alone. Like, show me you're here. Show me your goodness. Show me you love me. And then the one thing that is really important is look around to see how he's answering you. Like sometimes we sit in our time with the Lord and we ask these things, and then we go on with our day. And it's like, God's answering us. We want to look around. And when we look around, like, show me your goodness, it might not be like written on the sky, might be, but it might be like a friend texts you that day saying, hey, I see you. I care. How are you? It may be a myriad of things. And if we start associating those things with God's love and God's goodness, then that can change the way we view every part of our day. Whereas if we only see God's goodness in the answer to the prayer that we have asked for deliverance, and we don't see that God's sustenance is an even bigger answer. I love telling this story about the children of Israel and how they wanted to be delivered from slavery. So Moses, through lots of things, God used Moses to deliver them from slavery. They were super happy. Then Pharaoh was approaching them and they cried out, rather than just like, please deliver us again. They go back to like, why are you doing this to us? Like, you don't care. So then Moses parts the Red Sea with God. God does it. Moses is used by God. And then they're all excited. They're praising God, writing songs. And then days later, when they're hungry in the wilderness, they say, did you bring us in the wilderness to kill us? So those things didn't make them feel like God cared, because there's always something more. Like if God answers one prayer, there's another prayer waiting, because life in this world is fallen. And yet, where God showed them his love was in the wilderness. Like he provided manna every day. And that's what I would call sustaining grace.
Mm.
And they had to ask God for it every day. And God gave them everything they needed in the wilderness when they couldn't provide for themselves. And, in Deuteronomy 1, it's like that's when the Lord carries us. And he says, you saw, um, God carried you all the way as a man carries his son. And so recognizing it really is in the wilderness when God isn't doing the miraculous deliverance, but doing the work of sustaining us in the hardest of things, that we really get to know him and we're really changed. I don't think deliverance necessarily changes us the way that sustenance does.
Wow, I'm just going to leave that right there. I might listen to that again a couple more times. That was really, yes, and it's such a mindset shift, and it's needed. And I love bringing some psychology into this about how the neurons in our brain can be rewired. So as
Mhm.
we're choosing to look for the things and strengthening those good reward systems of this is God seeing me, we're rewiring our brain to look for God's goodness in our life, to look for His sustenance, and like it's like using a muscle. It gets stronger and stronger. It becomes more and more natural it's never natural because it's against the flesh, but it gets easier to see as we continually make that hard choice and teach our brains and our bodies to recognize those things.
Yes, yes. And I think even if like people are listening, they're like, I don't see that. Then ask God. Like God wants to answer all of these things. So just ask him, like, show me how you're sustaining me in this wilderness.
Yes. I have a lot of questions now I'm going to go ask God. That was good. Wow. Is there anything else you want to add to that before we move on to our next section or question?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, this one was good too. And it kind of leads right into where we are. And that is, where is God in the waiting? When God
Mhm.
doesn't meet our desires and we're waiting and begging Him to answer. How do you keep faith and hope?
Yeah. Well, I wrote that. That article is about Abraham, and I remember when this is back the time when my husband had left, and I really saw no other way than for us to get back together. Like I wanted him to repent, to change, for God to radically change him, and for him to come back and our family to be reunited. Like that was the only story that I thought God was going to write in my life. And so I was holding on to that, and it was years. And from the time he left to the time we got divorced was 3 years. And I remember thinking, God's going to do this. And then he didn't, and we got divorced. And that was a really painful thing for me. Like I was waiting all this time, assuming God was going to answer that prayer the way I had prayed it, and God didn't. And I remember reading in Romans 4 about how Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he talked about how um, his God, Abraham basically believed God's promises, even when he couldn't see any signs of them. And I thought, but he had a promise. I didn't have a promise to hold on to. So that was really annoying me. Like, of course, if God promised me he was going to do something, then it's not that hard to wait. But
Mhm.
it's much harder to wait if you don't know what the outcome's going to be. And so just kind of wrestling with God over why that seemed so much harder for me than people in the Bible who had these promises and maybe they had to wait years, but it's easier. And I really sensed that God was like, the faith of Abraham wasn't just waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. It was trusting in the promiser because we see, the promise Abraham was waiting for was Isaac. He had Isaac, but then God asked him to sacrifice Isaac. So basically, God is saying, like, are you willing to sacrifice the outcome that you have pinned your whole life on? And he didn't ask him actually ultimately to do that, but it's like, are you trusting me or are you trusting the outcome that you want? And I feel like so often I'm really trusting the outcome that I want. And that's what I'm putting my hope in. And that's what I'm waiting for. I'm not waiting for God. I'm waiting for God to answer the prayer that I asked him. And so I felt like God was shifting, like, I'm just waiting for God, and that is a very different thing. Like, God is doing today's work on whatever he's doing, and I may not see the fulfillment of what he's doing right now, but I can trust that, and recognizing Abraham and everybody in the Bible who waited. They were waiting for God. They didn't know what the outcome was gonna be. You look at Joseph, God was with him in prison and all of those places, but he didn't know what the outcome was gonna be. He wasn't holding on to that. He was holding on to God in the midst of all that long wait. And, the children of Israel, that was a long wait, 40 years, but there's hundreds of years, that we see in the Bible of silence. And what we do in the wait is hold on to God because he's what we're waiting for.
Wow. I didn't think of the verse, wait thou, my soul, wait thou only upon the Lord, from him is my expectation and my hope.
Yes. Yeah.
I love that. That brought that whole verse like, wow, home to me of just, he fulfills our expectations like with himself, and he's our only hope. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just letting all this soak in. I'm sure as everybody else is letting it marinate. I'm like, that is so true. And
Yeah.
appreciate
Yeah.
what
I
you.
used to think hope, when people were like, I'm hoping for something, I always thought hope was in an outcome. Like, I am hoping that I get what I have been wanting, praying for. And that they might be super godly things, but our hope isn't in an outcome. It's in Jesus, that he will give us the best outcome. And so then we don't have to be looking for signs like, oh, am I getting what I wanted? Is this going to turn out the way I wanted it to turn out? So almost like, for me, God is having to unpry my fingers from the outcomes that I think are best for me. And they're good outcomes, but God knows what he's doing with our lives, and we don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a matter of, like, I guess you're saying trusting him versus.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's easy to look around me and be like, okay, do I trust God if my circumstances are good? But do I trust God regardless? So I appreciate you sharing that. I'm just like sitting here soaking all this in. This is amazing. Thank you so much. Is there anything else you want to share along those lines of waiting on God, or anything else that you wanted to share about that before we move on to our next question?
No, but well, I would just say, for people who are listening or watching who are in the midst of a really hard wait, I would just start by talking to God about that. Like, I'm a super big, passionate person about lament and being real with God and not pretending that it's not hard, because God knows it's hard. So you don't have to be like, oh, I'm okay with the wait. You can say, God, I hate this wait. Like, help me to put my hope in you. Show me what that looks like today. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to let go of this outcome because it seems like the only good one. So open my eyes to see what you're doing and that you're with me. Like, I think the more we can talk to God about the things we're frustrated with, the closer we're going to be to God.
Yes. Yes, I'm a big fan of lament too.
Mm,
I definitely believe that the Lord knows everything in our heart, and it's okay to tell him. I bring this up often, is like, my counselor was like, it's okay to tell God you're angry, or even to visualize yourself. She was saying, like, beat on God's chest. I'm like, oh no, that's pushing it too far for me. He's like, no, I want you to tell God how angry you are. And it's really changed my prayer life. I don't go to God all the time and be like, I'm angry, but like, it just to pour those things out and to say, God, this is how I feel. Like, be raw and authentic with you. Like, I'm hurting. I don't understand who you are. And you sit there and you wait in that. And eventually he just comes and speaks truth to your heart. Doesn't change things, but he changes how I view things, and or gives me truth to hold on to. And that's, like, to me, where the peace comes from those things, like where you're wrestling God, even though you don't have all the answers to what exactly you're wrestling for. Sometimes you're like, God,
yeah.
give me this. But in the end, it's, you want his blessing. As Jacob said, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And his blessing is his presence and favor upon your life.
Yes. And yeah, I love that, Lauren, because it's funny, because this morning, so one of the places I was reading was Psalm 109, and that is an imprecatory prayer for, which is where David is basically saying about his enemies, like, God, I want them to be fatherless and their children begging for food. And I remember, like, and that nobody will feed them. I mean, it's like horrifying. And we think, why is he even praying that? Like, and I was looking at a couple of commentaries, and they were like, oh, this is like low. David shouldn't have been saying this. In the New Testament, we see, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. But I thought, wow, David's just being real. Like, don't we all think that? Like,
Yeah.
aren't we all saying, like, we don't dare to say it to God, but we might be like, yeah, I don't want them ever to have a happily ever after. Like,
Yes.
I mean, especially for people who are listening to this, if your spouse has really hurt you, walked away physically, emotionally, whatever it is, you're like, I'm not going to wish good things for them. And I just read in a book recently that was like, pray your desires. And because you're taking them to God, and God can do something with that. We don't just say all these wonderful holy words like, please best bless my ex-spouse and help them have a good life. But then inside there's all this bitterness and anger. Take that to God. And I thought David is basically like in that place. He's not king. He's like being hunted down by Saul's people. And this is how he feels. And I love his authenticity. Like, I'm going to take this to God. And when we take it to God, God holds it. And he can reshape our heart through that. So let's take even the things that we don't like and that we are saying, God, I actually want them to never be happy again. Like, I feel like we can say, God, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I want. But then, with Christ, it's like, but God, reshape my desires, but not deny them under this guise of, oh, good Christians don't do that. But be as honest as you can before God. And so it just kind of opened up Psalm 109 this morning, like, well, David's just being honest. This is how he feels. And I love the fact that God kept saying David is a man after his own heart, because David trusted God enough with his angry words.
Wow. And that's extremely liberating for me because I was taught, like, bless your enemies. So if somebody's done something really horrible to me, I immediately have to bless them. And it's one of those things that's very contrary to scripture. And I do believe God does to a certain extent, but like, I never thought about, yes, I can be authentic and say what I'm burying deep down inside to this person that's hurt me, as you mentioned, and former spouse or something like that. If they chose another person or abused you, you don't want to see them have a happily ever after in those things. It's like, but you couldn't choose me or those type of things. And it's
Right.
go in there and say, God, let him know
Right.
those things. Like, let them feel that pain too, and that's, and then it's not in a mean way, like you're wishing evil to them.
Yeah.
It's getting that thing out and being raw and authentic with God. So that area of your heart's not closed.
Right. And then you can say, like, because you're not invoking a curse on them. You're not like, God, wait, will you do this? As much as like, hey, this is what I want,
Mm-hmm.
but I am submitting to you. Revenge is yours. You will repay. And David's not taking revenge into his own hands there. He's like, I'm telling you, God, how I feel. And then God, like, just like lament, God changes our heart. Like, God can give us real love for people, but if we have to manufacture that love and feel like we got to say it, I don't think it ever happens. I mean, if I have to say about somebody that I really can't stand, oh God, I love them, that's really fake. But saying what I feel and then saying, God, I need your love. I need you to change me because this is where I am. I think those are things that God honors. Whereas when we put plastic words over our heart, I feel like they pull me farther and farther away from God and from that person, because I feel like I can't go to God about that person. I got to figure this out on my own and go to God with these wonderful holy words. And I think we go to God with every word we have, and we ask God to change us. So it's real change. So then we're really like, I struggled so long with my ex-husband. Now we're friends. Like, and I really deeply want his good. But if you asked me to manufacture that, I couldn't do it before. And I don't think God was calling me to do it.
Mm-hmm.
God changed me. I didn't change me.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's really good. And God does change us. And there's seasons where they may be friends, and there's seasons where they may do things again where you're like, hey, I've got to protect my own self here.
Yes.
And it's just like being willing to be open to the Lord to say, God, show me this person's heart too. And as far as a friendship or how those relationships look and work in those things. So
Yeah. Like just giving it all to God and trusting Him with it has transformed me.
wow. I'm like ready to go hit some time with Jesus now. I have a lot of things I want to say to Jesus. So I appreciate that, and the being able to share those things authentically. Thank you so much. You gave me a lot to think about there.
Oh,
And
yeah.
with your story too, there's been so much suffering, and so many times people are walking through suffering. It's really hard to know how to comfort them or know what to say to them. So what would you say that we should say? What would be an encouraging thing? How is the best way to comfort a hurting friend?
Yeah, well, there's lots of things. The biggest thing I would say is show up. And I have this little acronym, which is actually show up. And so the first thing is S, which is show up. Um, H is asking, like, how is today rather than how are you? Because pretty much we all say fine if people say, how are you? Or we don't know what to specifically talk about because how we are is a myriad of things. But it's like, how's today? Like, how is this moment? How has this hour been? It is, I think, a much more easily answerable question for people and is less likely to get sort of standard answers. Like people really feel like you care. So that's H. O is offer specific help. Don't say if somebody's struggling, like, call me if you need anything. Nobody ever calls for that. So it's like, hey, I'd given this an example. It's like, hey, I'm going to Target. I can either pick something up for you, or I can actually, if you want to meet me there, we can go together and shop and talk, or I can watch your kids so you can go to Target. So, like offering people specific things that you can do. You don't have to have great skills. I would say if you don't like to cook, don't make a meal. That's just, from personal experience and getting meals that from people who don't like to cook, like DoorDash is a great gift card. And W is words of encouragement. And I think people want to hear what they're doing well. I felt so discouraged because I thought of all the things I was doing wrong and all the ways I was failing. And so words of encouragement really help, whether they're in a text. I love, like, texts are easy because it could be like, I'm praying for you, just little tiny reminders of what people are doing well or that you're thinking about them, or notes or cards or any of those things. And then you of show up is use active listening, and most people want to talk about what's going on, and that's a really great way to be there for people who are struggling. Is like, hey, I just want to listen. Like, tell me anything, but not prying things. Like, tell me what really happened, or how do you, like, let people have the space to talk about what they want to talk about. But so you is active listening. It's kind of it helps often to sort of rephrase what somebody said, like, oh, I hear you're saying this, because sometimes that helps people even think about what they're saying or what they're thinking. And then P is pray. Just pray for them, text prayers. Sometimes I'll take a picture of what I'm reading in scripture and send it to somebody, and pray it for them. And because we want people to be praying for us.
Mhm.
So those are sort of my main, like, show up things. The other things I would say is don't minimize, don't say, "Oh, I know exactly what you're going through." Don't pry, don't say at least. At least is one of them is damaging, where it's like, at least you were married, at least you could have kids, at least basically it's saying it's not that bad. And you can say that to yourself, but to have somebody else sort of minimize your pain in the midst of it is really painful.
Mhm.
So I would say those are my big, and don't ignore what the person's going through, because sometimes people don't know what to do. So they do nothing. And that's painful too. And so just a text, a note, and it's never, ever, ever too late. Ever. Like, if you're listening and you're like, I should have said something, but I didn't. I should have taken a meal, but I didn't. Like, you can take a meal now, or you can text. And so I would say don't avoid somebody or a situation because you think it's been too long, because I don't think it's ever too late.
Wow, that was really helpful for me too, as well. Thank you. showing up for people means a lot, even if you don't have the words to say, because sometimes we just don't, and we're just like, I'm here, and just knowing that we love them. They know that we love them and care for them is important. So thank you. And
Yeah.
I'd like to close out something that hit my mind again is, what words of encouragement would you give a hurting woman today that's watching this, that's been through domestic abuse, maybe feels her life's shrunk apart, is hopeless, wondering if, everything, like going through court, got a lot myriad of things in front of her, and she's like, I feel like my life is ruined and I'm hopeless. What would you say to her?
Mm. I would say, hang on. You're in the middle of your story. God is with you everywhere you go, whether you go into court or you're with your family or just when you're alone and crying and wondering what has happened to your life. Call out to God. He's right there. And He wants to meet you where you are. I would recommend just opening up the Psalms. There's so many beautiful Psalms, and writing out like what the psalmist says and what your own raw words of lament are to the Lord. Like Psalm 13 is a great one. It's not that long. Just open the scripture and ask God to meet you. Don't feel like you need to bring anything but your need to God. That's all you need to bring. And ask Him to do everything else.
Thank you. Well, it's been such a privilege to be here with you today. My heart is very much been encouraged, and I hope everybody else's heart's been encouraged. And we will be making your interview available through different segments throughout the month of June. So people can catch this in smaller clips too. And I'm so excited to share the things that you shared here again throughout the month, because it was like, wow, there's so many things I want to marinate on. So I recommend y'all listen to the whole interview. This was really so, so good. So thank you so much for your time and for being here. And we appreciate you. And I appreciate your heart for the Lord and just sharing that truth with others and taking time to let us see how you found them in your suffering. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Lauren. I've so enjoyed this
Okay.
conversation.
Good. Well, I hope everybody has a good day. And thank you for joining us today. And feel free to leave any questions. Vaneetha, if they want to connect with you, how is the best way to find your blogs? Where is the best place to go?
If you just go to vaneetha.com, that will be that will be the place. And so you can find all the blogs, and you can search topics in the bottom if there's something specific that you are looking for, an article. You can do it that way with like a word that you're interested in, and you can find it hopefully.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Ah, thank you.